Since 1949, the Communist Party of China and the Nationalists on Taiwan have been in a veritable state of civil war. It has been largely peaceful in the decades here of late, but now then things are getting a little bit more stirred up, and they have been for a number of years. And all of a sudden, what used to be a standard American political position of saying we recognize there is one China, and then we leave vague whether that's the one on Taiwan or the one in Beijing, and that we recognize we have a diplomatic engagement in Beijing, and that we do not recognize the independence of Taiwan. That's kind of been the bedrock of American diplomacy for decades. But now, of just the last few years, people are trying to start changing that. And now then we're saying, well, Taiwan's really an independent country, and we don't even want to worry about coming together anymore. And that is raising the tensions in the region. China's military buildup is adding to some of that tension. And we're trying to see, where is this going to go, and what interest does this have for the United States? Is this something we should go to war over? Or is this something that we should avoid at all costs? And to try and answer that question today, we have a great guest, one of my fellow workers at Defense Priorities, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, Dr. Jennifer Kavanaugh. Jennifer, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Yeah, me too. And you've been kind of really making news yourself here lately. I mean, you've been in the New York Times. You now then hear this one. You've been in Foreign Affairs with the Taiwan fixation. That was from earlier this year, the March-April time frame, and it really is timely, even to today, because there's been some additional information out of China just this or earlier today on Global Times, where they were complaining about a conversation or a speech yesterday given by Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te, which we'll get to here in just a minute. But, first of all, we're going to talk about specifics here, but just kind of how do you approach this in terms of what is in America's vital national interests?
Well, when you think about Asia generally, I think the number one U.S. interest is access to key economic markets in Asia. That's the reason why Asia tends to be seen as the most important region in the world for the United States, because it is the area where the U.S. has the biggest economic potential going forward in the future. And that's a change from the past, where a lot of U.S. trade was concentrated on Europe. Europe's still an important trading partner, but the future really is in Asia with China, Japan, South Korea, and other countries in the region like India. And so when we think about what the U.S. needs to make sure that it has access to those markets, it's really about protecting maritime commerce routes. Now, some people argue that requires that Taiwan remain outside of China's control, that the United States continue to have unfettered access to the South China Sea. I tend to disagree. I think the United States could protect its economic interests and have access to markets in the region, no matter what happens to Taiwan, by going through the Philippine Sea and still being able to reach Japan and South Korea. So I think the debate here is a Taiwan that is separate from China, as we have today with the status quo, as you described accurately. It's not an independent country, but it is not controlled politically by China. Is this required for U.S. vital interests? I would say no. Many people in U.S. would say yes, and I hope we can dig into kind of this debate in this
We do, but I want to go a little bit further, even with the framework that you use there, because you said we could go through Philippines and several other kinds of straits, but I have not seen anything that would lead me to believe that in the event in the future that Taiwan fell to China by whatever means, whether peaceful or otherwise. I mean, in fact, we even look at it from the otherwise. If it fell because China took it, that all of a sudden our trade would not be able to go through those areas, that China would attack us or something, because China needs trade. China needs trade with us. So do you think, let me put this in the form of a question, in the event that Taiwan fell, would China block our transit and our access to the sea lanes in that area?
I think it's probably unlikely. As you say, China has an interest in global trade as much as the United States does. Having control of Taiwan would make it easier for them to do so. So I think, in the United States, the Navy and many of our political leaders are used to the idea that the United States can sail and fly wherever international law allows. And so the idea of having key sea lanes where another country could interdict U.S. access is something that is seen as very dangerous and something that must be avoided. My point is more generally that even if the worst case scenario happened and China seized Taiwan and blocked U.S. access, the United States would still be able to protect its economic interests, which further lowers the strategic value of Taiwan and makes it even more unnecessary to think about taking on the costs of fighting for Taiwan.
Now, I want to pull up a map here because I think this is kind of interesting. Because just take a look at here. All right, so here's Taiwan right here. And so the idea and the fear is that if China owns this, then somehow that's going to block us off. But if China wanted to block us from anything, I mean, they have plenty of naval power already in this area and here. And if they have never made any moves to stop anything going around here, why would they, if they suddenly had whatever it is, 120, 130 miles further outland or out into the sea, would they suddenly become a threat that they currently aren't? How do you see that?
I think you're right that China already has significant naval capabilities. I think that we underestimate how difficult it would be to blockade sea lanes, and areas like the South China Sea would be very difficult. And it's not even clear that China has the military capabilities to do that. If they controlled Taiwan, it would make it marginally easier for them to do that. They could operate from both sides of the strait. They would be able to operate on the east side of Taiwan, which would allow them some additional power projection capabilities into the Philippine Sea. That would allow them to kind of extend their reach, make it and extend any sort of perimeter that they set up to block U.S. or foreign ships. So it would make it marginally easier for them to do that. But
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you're right that the difference is the gains are marginal, and I think that's a really important point. Is that there's been this idea in DC that a change in the status of Taiwan would be militarily devastating to the United States, and that's just not the case. The gains China would get militarily are small.
Right, and so let's look even further in that area there, and that is the intent of the Chinese or their nature, I guess, as can be divined from the outside. For example, in the reason why so many were afraid of Hitler in the 1930s is because he was an aggressive power, and especially as it got later in the year, he took more and more provocative action. He had a bigger military that was capable of doing a lot more, and if it had continental aspirations, they had a force that could actually do it. So they had both, with Mein Kampf and several other things that he had said, lots of evidence that said, hey, there's reason to be afraid here. But when I look at the Chinese, and you correct me if I'm wrong because you studied a lot more than I do, it doesn't seem to me that they are an expansionist power in their history. I mean, even if you're just limited it to 1949 forward, the Communist Party itself seems much more intent on protecting its borders and protecting its economic markets economically than with using military force to coerce anybody. How do you see that?
I think that's generally true, especially after Mao. I think Mao had a little bit of a different philosophy about kind of spreading the communist ideology. But certainly after that time, I think China has been more focused on husbanding its military capabilities and focusing on economic development. I think that, in recent years, there has been growing concern about their expansionist interests and what they might want in terms of global power. But I think the model that people use to measure Chinese ambitions is U.S. ambitions in the post-World War II era. Right. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I don't think that China has a goal to expand and have hundreds of military bases around the world and become sort of a global hegemon in the way the United States has tried to become a global hegemon. And I think we see that already in places like the Middle East, where China could project power much more effectively if it wanted to, but it seems sort of uninterested for a very good reason, as we've seen from the United States, to get too deeply involved. So I think its real interest, at least in the near term, even though it does have increasing blue water Navy capabilities, which allow it to reach further from its homeland, its real interest is in sort of protecting its regional power and its regional interests. And there, I think you even have to make a distinction between its aspirations towards Taiwan and how it thinks about Japan and South Korea and the Philippines. So one argument that some people make is that if China takes Taiwan, then that's just the first step, and that the appetite will grow by eating, right? And so the next will be Okinawa and Luzon, and they're going to expand across the whole region. But Taiwan and the rest of the region are in two very different buckets. The Chinese see Taiwan as a domestic issue, whereas these other countries, not only are they would they be much more difficult to take on militarily, given distances and things like that, but they're not seen as sort of a domestic issue in the same way.
Right. Yeah. And I'm showing on the screen here, you can see that Taiwan's literally whatever it is, about 100 miles across. But if you're talking about going up into Japan or into South Korea, you have a vast open sea area. Now then it's militarily, it's orders of magnitude more difficult than 100 miles, which is obviously very difficult in its own right. But I just don't see that militarily that's something that China would be able to do or would have any interest in doing, for that matter.
Yeah, certainly not in the near term. I mean, it would be incredibly difficult for China to take control of even Okinawa, let alone the rest of Japan. Amphibious invasions are the most difficult things that militaries can take on. Without air superiority, only about 13% of amphibious invasions have succeeded. And the Chinese, even thinking about Taiwan, which is 90 miles off their coast, can't be guaranteed of air superiority. So even an invasion of Taiwan would be risky. Beyond that, it's very unlikely that they would have air superiority out towards Japan. And so the risk and the chances that that an invasion would fail would be very high.
Right. Yeah. And Chinese don't, one thing they don't seem to be doing is big risk takers that could collapse their own form of government. So,
well, especially not after they've watched what happens in Ukraine, right? Like the key lesson for the Chinese coming away from Ukraine has to be, if we're going to do it, we have to make sure we can do it quickly and effectively and completely. They don't want to be in a situation where 4 years later they're still in a war of attrition with Taiwan and or its supporters.
Well, as I said at the top of the show here, for many decades, the relations were relatively stable between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Taiwan. It wasn't a big issue. It didn't pop up into the news very often. But here in the last few years, it has been. I think one of the bigger inflection points was when Nancy Pelosi officially went there. It had been kind of getting more in the time before that, but that really stirred things up. And then here is a comment from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in 2022 when he went to Taiwan and just lobbied for outright independence.
The United States government should immediately take necessary and long overdue steps to do the right and obvious thing, that is to offer the Republic of China Taiwan America's diplomatic recognition as a free and sovereign country.
Yeah, a funny thing about that, since 1949, China, or at least since 2005 specifically, when they formed a new domestic law or international law for China, is that they said any declaration of intent or moving towards independence would be a cause for them to go to war and to try and take Taiwan by force. So to do that would be to basically cross China's red line and dare them to do something about it. And then that was actually reinforced today on the Global Times, one of the China's official Communist Party outlet newspaper online, where they wrote, "We sternly warn that the lie," that's referring to the Taiwanese president, Lai Ching-te. "We warn the lie authorities that forgetting one's roots will lead to a bad end. Betraying the motherland will inevitably face historical judgment. Taiwan independence will ultimately result in self-destruction." So what do you think is behind some of the, and Pompeo's far from the only one. That's just one that we grabbed here to show the escalation of time. What do you think about is behind why we're making these statements when we know full well what China says?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think first, the Taiwan question is now really at the center of U.S.-China competition. And so for China hawks in D.C., of which there are many, the Taiwan issue is really paramount. And the idea of having Taiwan fall to China is something that they really cannot fathom because of their imagined implications, right? It's become the linchpin of U.S. primacy and of U.S. power, not just in Asia, but globally. Therefore, they're looking for ways to sort of needle China. They see this as an effective way to show U.S. commitment and U.S. power, that the U.S. is not going to back down in the face of Chinese threats. the response usually when China gets upset about these things is that like, this means it's working, right? If China's upset, we're doing the right thing. And like the point I always make is like, that's not deterrence. That's not like good policy. That's not working. Just because China's upset doesn't mean you've like moved the ball forward in a good direction. China can be, justifiably upset, just like the US can be justifiably upset. So that's one thing. The second thing I think is that, as we see the military balance in the region shifting, in China's favor, defending Taiwan from the United States would be very difficult. Taiwan is only 90 miles from the Chinese coast. China has an increasingly large missile arsenal and navy, and increasingly effective submarine and air force. So it would be very difficult. And as this balance shifts and questions begin to arise about whether or not the United States, if it decided to intervene, could actually keep China from taking Taiwan, I think the statements become more inflammatory to compensate for concern about military effectiveness.
Well, and speaking of military effectiveness, I've done a number of my own military analysis on the tasks that would be at hand because of all the things you just mentioned about China's development and evolution in all those different categories, plus their area access, area denial defense systems that they have, the technology that they've expended on, and especially in terms of anti-ship missiles, sea drones and sea drones as well as mines, etc. I've calculated that there's virtually no way that we could actually win a war against China over Taiwan, because they would aside from just the numerical comparisons, China would never allow the U.S. to defeat it and then maintain a presence 90 miles away from its coast. They would simply retool and then they would come back until they would try it again. And then we would have perpetual war, which could always escalate into nuclear war. So I think it's absurd. But unfortunately, that view is not held by a lot of people, especially those in the Pentagon, as John Bolton says here.
Our strategic thinking in the Pentagon and elsewhere is at full speed now to deal with both the possibility of an invasion and a blockade. We need significantly greater American military assets in the region. We need significantly greater military assets around the world. But in that part of the Pacific, we're woefully inadequate in naval strength. We don't have as many ships at sea as the Navy needs. They don't get built overnight. We need a big increase in naval shipbuilding. But we need to think through at a political military level how to deter China until we can get the wherewithal there that really would protect either against a Chinese invasion or a Chinese blockade.
Do we really need to build a military in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific area, that's big enough in all of those categories to be able to fight and win a war with China?
I mean, I think the answer there is no. I'm not sure that we could necessarily build a Navy or a military force that would guarantee a victory over China, as you suggested. I think the most likely outcome is that you see both sides fight to basically the point where neither has much in the way of munitions and capabilities left. And then, unfortunately, for Taiwan, what happens is that China still has enough cheap missiles and ships to just blockade the island. And at that point, the United States will not have the capabilities to run the blockade. And so then it's just sort of a slow bleed out until Taiwan runs out of supplies and its own munitions and things like that. So to me, that's sort of the most likely scenario.
I mean, that takes on added urgency given the current situation with the United States and how much of as you and I have been talking here recently on defense priorities about how many of our air defense interceptor missiles have been expended in the Middle East in service to Israel. And of course, the continued begging and pleading from Ukraine for us to send even more there. And we're basically at the end. And according to many reports, we've actually gone below what our stockpile is that we feel like we can maintain our own national security. If you were then to open up a fight in the Indo-Pacific, especially against China, I mean, the need would be through the roof compared to all the stuff that we've done in the last 3.5 years in these two conflicts. And I mean, I think we would run out in very short order, and our manufacturing capacity doesn't exist to be able to sustain a war of that nature. And I mean, we would be vulnerable, don't you think?
Well, I mean, I think there's two important points. The first one is that that you're right, that the United States is low on munitions, air interceptors and otherwise, and that it's not clear that there's enough to last through a long war with China. There's enough for maybe a couple of weeks, but it's most likely that a war with China would be significantly longer than that. My concern about munitions, as I always say, is I would like the United States to be doing less everywhere in the world, in the Middle East and in Ukraine and in Asia. But I also would like the Washington to have strategic flexibility, the ability to choose where it wants to intervene based on U.S. interests. And you get to a point where munitions are so low where the question isn't should the United States intervene to defend Taiwan, but can the United States intervene to defend Taiwan? And you want to be in the should world. Even if you decide no, you want to be in the should world. And it's
Totally
not clear
agree.
to me. It's not clear to me that we're still in the should world or that we will be there for long if we continue to expend missiles at the rate that we are. The second important point, though, is that I don't assess that it would be in the U.S. strategic interest to intervene to defend Taiwan. So even though I'd like to be in the should world, I still would decide no, because I don't think that Taiwan has strategic importance for the United States that's worth the cost of a war with China. The cost of a war with China would be astronomical. The economic cost would be in the trillions of dollars, and the cost in terms of lives and material is in the military would make losses in Iraq and Afghanistan seem tiny. You're talking in the tens or even hundreds of thousands of U.S. casualties. You're talking dozens of U.S. ships at the bottom of the ocean. You're talking the loss of dozens of aircraft and things like that. Admiral Scott Swift, who's a former Navy admiral, always says that the price of entry into a war over Taiwan is 2 aircraft carriers. And what he means by that is that what he means by that is if you enter the war, you should assume that the United States will lose 2 aircraft carriers. There's about 5,000 people per aircraft carrier. So that's 10,000 people right there. They don't all, perish, but that are, without a ship and in the ocean and being rescued. So
and all the air squadrons that go along with it.
Exactly. So that would be devastating. So in order to warrant that cost, the strategic value of what you're fighting for has to be really high. And for Taiwan, that's just not the case. The military gains to the United States are small. The gains China would get from seizing the island are small. If China were to seize Taiwan, it would not cause the end of U.S. economic access to the region, as we were discussing before. It would not collapse U.S. alliances. If anything, countries in the region would be more concerned about China and would invest more in their defense to balance against it. And then, the tough question then that remains is, the economic value of Taiwan, the semiconductors. It's true that Taiwan is an important source of the most advanced semiconductors, but the United States is investing in domestic capacity in that area to build resilience. And there are, ways that the United States could get by for a time on sort of second generation chips. So rather than investing in defending Taiwan, a better strategy would be to, begin stockpiling.
That's a great point.
The sort of just a little bit less good technology that maybe isn't perfect for what you want, but it does enough of the job to maintain basic systems. So
it really does increase our strategic security. Makes us less vulnerable. That's a great point. We just basically just kind of ran through real quick what seems reasonable to me, an analysis that we don't have the capacity to wage and win a war against China for all the different reasons we've talked about. But the chief of the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, earlier this year gave a speech that seems to think that we can win a war.
President Trump has also said that Communist China will not invade Taiwan on his watch. So our goal is to prevent war, to make the cost too high, and peace the only option. And we will do this with a strong shield of deterrence forged together with you, America's great allies and defense partners. Together, we will show what it means to execute peace through strength. In many ways, seen and unseen, overt and covert. But if deterrence fails, and if called upon by my commander-in-chief, we are prepared to do what the Department of Defense does best, to fight and win decisively.
To fight and win decisively if called on
Is
to
that
do
what the
so against
Department of
China.
Defense has done best? I don't know. If you look at the Middle East over the past 20 years, it tells a different story. But
Right. I mean, you see how hard of a time we had with the mighty Houthi rebels in Yemen to keep the Red Sea open. So not really a good track record. But I mean, what do you make of that? Because I mean, it's a great speech. I mean, delivered well in terms of speaking and authority and dramatic pauses and all that kind of stuff. That's good. But I mean, does anybody really believe that that's true, especially in Beijing?
well, I mean, I think Beijing doubts U.S. resolve, doubts U.S. capabilities, doubts whether the United States has sufficient reserves. That doesn't mean that they aren't aware that the United States is a formidable military adversary. It doesn't mean that they're sure they can win, but certainly they are not quite as sure in U.S. capabilities as Secretary of Defense Hegseth indicated he was in that speech. I also think it's important to note that he talks about preventing war by preparing for war. In my mind, that's the wrong formulation. In my mind, those are two different things. Preparing for war and preventing war require different strategies. And it's clear that the United States and China are currently preparing for war, but that's quite dangerous because it leads to sort of massive effort to build up military capabilities in the first island chain, so that both sides are sort of standing eye to eye with missiles ready to fire, and that is very risky, very prone to miscalculation that leads to military confrontation that would be devastating for everyone in the region and globally. Preventing war is a different approach that requires sort of a defensive effort to protect U.S. assets, to protect U.S. interests, combined with a diplomatic effort to stabilize cross-state relations with China. And that may mean compromises that in terms of commitments to maintaining the status quo that move in the opposite direction of Pompeo's statements that you shared earlier, and sort of in the opposite direction of John Bolton's recommendations. But that might be necessary to stabilize the region and prevent war. President Trump is in sort of an ideal position here as sort of a transactional president who has very little reluctance to challenge sort of conventional thinking on issues, to take this on and to move the ball forward in terms of stabilizing this issue or removing this issue from the center of U.S.-China relations.
Well, now, in fact, you've got a piece coming out aside from that foreign affairs piece. You got a piece that's about to come out. You shared part of it with me today. One of the things that really jumped off at me was that you said that Trump says that he wants to be a peacemaker, and maybe one of the best places he can bring that to fruition is in China. What do you mean by that?
Well, Trump has made clear that he wants to be a peacemaker, right? He talks all the time about the peace deals he's forged around the world. He talks about in his inauguration address that he wants his legacy to be not the wars that he wins, but the wars that he doesn't fight, that are wars that he avoids. And so, we've seen in Ukraine the struggles to forge a peace agreement. Witkoff was in Russia today. We've seen the struggles in the Middle East, both with Iran and in trying to end the war in Gaza. But he has a real opportunity in Asia. There's no war yet, and he has an opportunity to avoid a war. But that requires taking real actions to de-escalate tensions in the cross-state relationship. It requires probably reining in President Lai, who has been quite provocative and confrontational in his approach to China, as you shared earlier. And it means reaching
out. And I'm sorry, let me just go down that path, because I have seen that myself. And I've heard it from others, but what is he doing different than his predecessors were doing that seems to make China more unhappy?
Well, he's just been very forward-leaning in terms of some of his language, referring to Taiwan as already being an independent sovereign country, and declaring China a hostile foreign force, and things that try to drive a divide between China and Taiwan, which is the exact opposite of the way China has tried to portray the situation, right? That this is like one people, so that they will be unified. And so, his language has been much more confrontational. He's done this in multiple different speeches and been much more forward-leaning. And it's, the rhetorical differences are small but important. When it comes to Taiwan, the specific language chosen, specific words chosen matter a lot on all sides: China's side, U.S. side, and Taiwan side. And
why do you suppose that he may be doing that now? Is this an attempt to get the U.S. to back him? Does he think he's got the U.S. backing so he can take that risk? What's politically driving, or national security wise, driving this change as far as you can ascertain?
Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, he's always been forward leaning. This is not a change for him since he came to office. He was known in his political career as someone who was forward leaning on this issue. That was a concern that China had right from the start, and has kind of borne out. I do think that Taiwan right now is overconfident in its support, in its belief that the U.S. will support it. You see that in the underspending in defense, spending 2.5% of defense when you're 90 miles from China and China wants to reunify with you seems kind of bonkers to me. Even Israel, who has military capabilities that far surpass its neighbors, spends 5% of GDP on defense. So that's just far too little.
What do you think should be? What would be the right number for them if they were serious about their national defense?
Well, Stephen and I wrote in our foreign affairs article, like 4% should be the minimum. I would be comfortable saying that 5 or 6% would be totally within bounds. Bridge Colby, who is now Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, called in his testimony or his confirmation hearing, for 10%. I think 10% is probably higher than they could manage. So, I think 5 or 6% would be a good goal for, over the next 5 to 10 years, sort of a minimum goal. But Taiwan has suggested that it expects U.S. support in other ways too. I mean, its military plans, it's been revising them, and it's kind of been very vocal about how great this is. It's revising and updating its military plans to take on a, asymmetric approach. But if you read between the lines, like the intent of this strategy is to help them hold out until the Americans arrive. So it's premised on the idea that they only have to fight on their own for a certain amount of time, which means that their plan A for self-defense is the Americans come and save us.
Man, and there's no plan B that's going to work. So,
I mean, there's a plan B in which they could potentially deter China from trying by making it clear that it would be very costly and painful to do so. It's possible that they could make it so costly that you have a Ukraine situation where China doesn't end up taking the island, but they end up agreeing to some sort of political compromise. We don't know how China might pursue an invasion. It might not be sort of all out. Having learned from Russia's experience in Ukraine, they might do something like, start an invasion, and then if it seems like it's going really badly, kind of back off, be like, that's it, and see what kind of political concessions they could get for that. So, I think there are worlds in which Taiwan can preserve the status quo, at least for a time. But they're not really investing in that approach, and that's not what their defense strategy is geared to do. It's geared to, basically hold out until America comes. And
2.5% is not going to get you much beyond a plan A. I want to go to your article here, the Taiwan fixation, because there was 4 big points in here I see that you made that I want to get you to expand on a little bit. Number one is you say that Taiwan is of low strategic imperative for the United States. Now, that seems to go against what a lot of people think publicly. Why do you hold that position?
Well, I mean, the reasons that people think that Taiwan is strategically important to the United States, number one, its military value, especially the concern that if China were to take over Taiwan, they would be able to use the island either as sort of like an aircraft carrier and put missiles on the island, allow them to fire further, and hold U.S. Bases along the second island chain or elsewhere in the region at risk. There's a concern that they might base their submarines on the eastern side of Taiwan. Right on the eastern side of Taiwan, there's a big drop-off underwater. So submarines in that area can quickly sort of disappear into the depths. There's concern that if China right now, China's submarines are quite noisy and easy to track because you can catch them when they're in the Taiwan Strait and when they're trying to exit the Taiwan Strait. Where it's shallow, sort of easier to find them. The concern is that once they are on the eastern side, if they can base there, it'll be very hard to track them. So they could disappear in underwater and, approach the U.S. Without the U.S. knowing until it's kind of, much further on in the game. So that's another concern. I see these as sort of small benefits. I don't think that being able to base submarines on the eastern side benefits China like all that much. And in any case, eventually Chinese submarines are going to be quiet enough, just like U.S. submarines, to sort of disappear wherever they want. So eventually we're going to lose that benefit anyway. Building a missile arsenal and base on Taiwan would take years, not something they're going to have quickly. Would give plenty of time to kind of compensate. So I don't see the island as having the same sort of military value. I mentioned before, I don't see the economic value as being all that high. It's obviously important, but not irreplaceable. It's also not clear to me that the semiconductor fabs last through a war. So people say, like, we have to defend Taiwan because of the semiconductors. Okay, so you fight over Taiwan. You really think the semiconductor manufacturing facilities are going to survive?
Yeah.
They're not. They're going to be blown up by the U.S. or by China. So, like, I don't see that them surviving. So to me, if there's a war over Taiwan, the semiconductors are gone anyway.
That's a great point. Yeah.
It's also true that, this capability would not fall into Chinese hands if China were to seize the island and the semiconductor fabs survived, because most of the production relies on Western intellectual property, which isn't stored on Taiwan. It's stored elsewhere and could be cut off. So you have the ability to limit that. In any case, China's probably going to have the capability to build the most advanced semiconductors on its own pretty soon. Again, you're kind of diminishing value here.
Yeah.
The third argument people make is about U.S. alliances, that if Taiwan falls, all partners in the region will doubt U.S. credibility and will bandwagon with China. But if you talk to people in the region, that's not what they're going to do. They're not going to watch China take over Taiwan and then decide to form an alliance with China. They're going to be concerned for their own security. They're going to invest more in their own defense. They're going to potentially move in closer to the United States or balance together amongst themselves to protect themselves. So I just don't see Taiwan as having the strategic importance that people say it does. It's not going to shift the balance of power in the region were China to control it. So I think it makes a lot more sense for the United States to think about its interests elsewhere in the region and invest in those. It certainly doesn't make sense to take on the cost of a war with China over Taiwan. It's just not existential to the United States. And if the U.S. is going to fight a war with China, the issue at the core of that war should better be existential to U.S. security and prosperity.
And this is not. You've kind of touched already on the second point there of what else could Taiwan do for its own defense. So I'll move on to the number 3, which is, you says the best U.S. strategy is to balance China's power. What does that mean in practical terms, to balance China's power?
So right now, the U.S. approach to China is more one of dominance. It wants to be the dominant power in Asia. It's getting increasingly difficult as China gets more and more military capabilities and its economy grows. So balancing Chinese power just makes sure, it's just this idea that the United States wants to make sure that it is at least a co-equal power with China in the region. And what that requires is that countries like Japan and South Korea are not controlled by China, because that's where the real industrial power in Asia is. India too, right? As long as those countries are either U.S. partners or independently, like not aligned outside of China's orbit, then the United States can maintain a balance of power with China in the region. And that doesn't require any sort of U.S. control or U.S. defense of Taiwan. It's independent of Taiwan. So it's a much less escalatory strategy, much easier for the United States to attain militarily, and much less provocative to China, because you can do it mainly by investing a little bit more in Japan and investing more along the second island chain in Asia, which is things like Guam and the Mariana Islands and Micronesia.
And doesn't risk sinking 2 aircraft carriers. So there's that bonus too.
Yeah.
Number 4, you said that we should prioritize U.S. interests. What does that mean, to prioritize U.S. interests? And if you could talk militarily, diplomatically, and politically, and economically, how do we actively, in terms of actual policies, prioritize American interests?
Right. So, I mean, first, prioritizing U.S. interests. By that I mean, like, making sure that no matter what happens to Taiwan, U.S. interests are protected. So economically, top priority is access to markets. In order to protect that, you need to make sure the United States can access at least the Philippine Sea. Philippine Sea is big. It would be very difficult for China to control. So that's actually quite easy. If the United States invests in some of its bases in Japan, builds up Japanese military capabilities, or helps Japan build its military capabilities, and invests in its infrastructure along the second island chain. Submarines can play a big role. So that's kind of a plug for investing in the U.S. submarine industrial base. That is all that's really required economically. So the posture, military changes kind of go along with that. I think the best approach is really to pull U.S. forces back to a certain degree from the first island chain, to move them away from places like Okinawa, where they're very vulnerable, to move them away from Luzon, where they're very vulnerable, to get the trainers off of Taiwan, where they're nothing more than a tripwire. Those types of moves will not only be de-escalatory and suggest some accommodation to China. The United States does not want a war, but they also will allow the United States to invest in places where where U.S. forces will be better protected. So if there were to be a conflict, they would survive that conflict, as would their planes and ships and things like that.
And I was just going to say, and just kind of in general, I mean, the one thing we haven't even touched on yet in the potential clash between the United States and China is the potential that the war could escalate into nuclear realm. What do you think of the concerns of that?
Well, obviously, any war between two nuclear powers, you have to worry about nuclear weapons. I think the biggest risk of nuclear war is a couple of things. I think first, if China really thought that it were going to lose, not fight to attrition where they could then use a blockade, but actually thought they were going to lose, they might be tempted to use nuclear weapons. But the bigger risk is if the United States starts conducting ground strikes on mainland China. That's not like official U.S. policy, and it's something that the president would have to authorize separately. But the U.S. has the capabilities to do it, and they've made that clear by deploying this Typhoon system to the Philippines, because that system can fire Tomahawk missiles, which can reach anywhere from 1,500 miles to 2,500 miles. In Luzon and elsewhere in the Philippines, they're quite close to the Chinese coast, so that would be deep inside of China. And this would allow the United States to hold at risk key command and control nodes in China, as well as to hit, civilian infrastructure and potentially conduct regime decapitation strikes, which would take out Chinese leaders. Those for China would be existential threats that could cause them to escalate to nuclear war, especially because once you start hitting mainland targets, China might not be able to be sure whether the United States was aiming at conventional targets in mainland China or trying to take out China's nuclear arsenal. And if they suspected that the United States might be trying to take out their nuclear arsenal, then they would, want to use their own nuclear capabilities to prevent that. And that could mean tactical nuclear strikes on targets in the region, or worst case scenario, it could mean strategic nuclear strikes on the U.S. homeland.
Right. All of which just really, really underscores why it would be foolish to even contemplate fighting a war with China over anything in Taiwan. Like you say, unless it's an existential threat to us directly, it would just almost be suicidal to even go down that road. So you've definitely painted that picture today, and we really appreciate it. Before I let you go, though, I'd like your comment and observations on something happening in the Middle East. It came out yesterday in, I think it was Reuters, reported that Trump says, hey, how's about we take over the Gaza Strip and start feeding everybody, since it's really hard for Israel to do that. What do you think of that?
What I thought of that when I first read it is not suitable for broadcast on any show. Sanitized version is that it's obviously it's a terrible idea. First of all, we have a history of U.S. Governance or stability operations in the Middle East, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, not quite in the Middle East, but close by. These have been a catastrophe and a real failure. The United States military is not built to be a government. It's not a military task. So it should not be assigned these types of sort of political nation building tasks, which is what this would be. Now, Iraq, I think, would be simple compared to the situation in Gaza, which is just a total, at this point, a wasteland. You have a famine or close to a famine. I guess there's legal terms about what actually qualifies a famine. So mass starvation. You have Hamas remnants that are still fighting. You have some portion of the population that's been radicalized by Israeli action. You still have Israeli forces. It's not clear to me whether they're all going to withdraw, but we've seen in places like Syria and Lebanon that even when they withdraw, they keep using military force. And so it's just not clear to me that this is a mission that the United States could feasibly do. Certainly, spending taxpayer money on this type of effort is not in U.S. interests. It would be quite expensive. And given all the other things that the U.S. military is trying to do globally, deter Iran, deal with challenges in Ukraine, deal with the things in Asia that we've just been talking about this show, it's not clear to me that they have the capacity to take on this task. So to me, this is like a no-brainer, terrible idea that should be just discarded out of hand. Not to mention the fact that this is exactly what President Trump promised he wouldn't do when he came into office, was to get the United States involved in these endless long-term military operations. And he promised it again when he was in Riyadh this year, that we would do no more nation building. But that's exactly what this would be. So really, this would be an affront to people who supported him, as well as to the American people who are, generally quite tired of this type of foreign campaign.
Well, so let's look at the other half of that equation, because also yesterday, Netanyahu says that our change in strategy is going to be, instead of occupying only 75% of the Gaza Strip, we're going to occupy 100% of it. And apparently it's going to be probably rubber stamped by the Knesset tomorrow, as I understand. But that seems to be his intent. And I think it was the Times of Israel reported in a news article we showed earlier today that Netanyahu has apparently formally said his war aims are to adopt the Trump policies from earlier this year, where he said he's going to turn the Gaza Strip into a resort on the sea. And so that is their policy. So how is that going to work out? Just aside from take the morality out of it for the moment, which is hard to do, but how about just the practicality of it? Can Israel completely move in to occupy the Gaza Strip and have some kind of an outcome that's positive for Israel?
I mean, I certainly don't think so. I mean, they can take over Gaza Strip. Their military is capable of controlling it to some extent. I don't think, though, it will help them to achieve their strategic ends. They've damaged Hamas's military capabilities, but they're never going to get rid of it. Hamas is it's not like something you can just totally wipe out. If anything, the Israeli military campaign has probably radicalized more people than were kind of willing to support Hamas before. They may not be fighters right now, but that's sort of the long-term trajectory. Yeah. It's not clear, what that total control military plan means for like the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is atrocious, and how that's going to be addressed. If the plan really is to turn Gaza into the new Riviera and expel the Palestinians, it's not clear where they're going to go. It's not clear who's going to execute that mission. It's not clear who's going to rebuild. And more generally, just the long-term military occupation of Gaza, filled with hostile Palestinians or starving Palestinians, isn't really an improvement for Israel's security long-term. And it's also a drain on its resources. It's expensive. So to me, it seems like a kind of very bad outcome that's really manufactured to keep a crisis that, it's politically beneficial to Netanyahu, but it hurts almost everyone else. Most Israelis would prefer to have the hostages back and the war over, I think.
Yeah. You see that headline right there, 5 IDF divisions in 5 months, Netanyahu's Gaza occupation plans. Well, since they haven't been able to militarily defeat Hamas in we're closing in on 24 months here, I don't know that 5 months with 5 divisions is going to get anything done, because, it's just, I just don't see that going to happen militarily.
We've seen this before, not to this scale, but I mean, we've seen the same cycle, right? This isn't the first time Israel has tried to sort of wipe out a terrorist group that was threatening it. And even if it's not Hamas, it will be something else, right? Like the issue here is a political issue between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's not going to be solved with military force. Military force may offer some sort of temporary pause, but, I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 years we're having the same conversation. Maybe it's a different group. Maybe it's a slightly different territory. But you don't solve a political grievance with a military solution. You need a political solution. So until that political solution is found, this is just going to keep happening at different scale and in different formats over and over, like we've seen over the past however many years, 75 years or whatever.
Right. Well,
sorry, that's super depressing note to end on.
And we're probably not going to solve it here in a 1 hour show, but I appreciate you, Liv, if nothing else, bringing light to this and to explaining to what's really going on here on both the issues with in the Indo-Pacific as well as in the Middle East. Really appreciate your expertise and look forward to having you back again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Look forward to next time.
Thank you very much. And also let you guys know, by the way, let some of your friends know who may not even watch videos, but need the same level of truth and uncompromised and truthfulness that you get here, and send them to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere they get their podcast. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive and you will find us waiting there for you. Also, to your friends who may want to get their information on the written form, we also have a Substack there. You see Daniel Davis Deep Dive, all one word, .substack.com, where we have information there. You can see both our videos and our written products as well. Got something for everybody there. So make sure you spread the good news around, because you don't want to keep all this good truth and information to yourself there. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.